Everyone knows how the Library of Alexandria died. A fire, a villain holding the torch, pick your culprit. Julius Caesar, a Christian mob, a Muslim caliph. The story always comes with a face to blame and a single terrible night when the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled went up in smoke. It is a satisfying story. It is dramatic and clean and easy to remember. And here is the problem with it. Almost none of it is true. The library did not die in a night. It died the way most great things die. Slowly, quietly, over centuries, while almost no one was watching. Let me take you to the place where it began. Picture the harbour at Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era. The city is barely a few decades old, founded by Alexander the Great after he marched into Egypt around 332 before the Common Era. He would be dead within the decade, gone at Babylon in 323, and the empire he built would be carved up among his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, a man named Ptolemy, who crowned himself king and pharaoh and made this young coastal city his capital. The harbour never sleeps. Ships arrive from every corner of the known world, grain barges from the Nile Delta, traders from Persia, scholars from Athens. The air smells of salt and tar and drying papyrus. Above it all rises the great lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the world, its fire visible for miles out to sea. And somewhere behind the royal quarter sits a building that will outlast the lighthouse in human memory, though not one stone of it survives today. They call it the Mauseon, the seat of the Muses. It is where we get the word museum. Here is the part most people get wrong. The dream of the library is usually credited to Alexander himself, but according to the historical record compiled in Britannica, the idea most likely came not from the conqueror, but from the general who inherited his empire, Ptolemy I. He handed the task to a former Athenian politician named Demetrius of Phaleron, around 295 before the Common Era. The instruction, preserved in an ancient text called the Letter of Aristeas, was breathtaking in its ambition. Collect, if possible, all the books in the world. All of them. Not a library, the library. A single room meant to hold the entire mind of the human race. And they pursued that goal with a ruthlessness that would make a modern collector blush. Under Ptolemy III, who reigned from 246 to 221 before the Common Era, the city passed a law unlike anything before it. Every ship that docked at Alexandria was searched, not for contraband, but for books. Any scroll found aboard was confiscated, carried to the library, and copied by hand. The copy was returned to the owner. The original stayed in the stacks. The physician Galen, writing centuries later, recorded this practice, and the way I read it, it tells you everything about how Alexandria saw itself. This was not a city that asked for knowledge, it took it. How many scrolls ended up there? The honest answer is that nobody knows. The figures handed down to us range wildly, anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls at the height of the collection. Some ancient writers spoke of more than 500,000 documents drawn from Assyria, Greece, Persia, Egypt, India, and a dozen civilizations besides. And here's what I find striking about that uncertainty. We cannot even agree, within an order of magnitude, on how much was lost. The wound is so old that we have forgotten the size of it. Now we come to the fires. Because there were fires, that part is true. In 48 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar found himself trapped in the harbour, outnumbered, pursuing his rival Pompey into Egypt. He ordered the ships in the port set ablaze. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us the flames spread from the docks into the city, reaching the district where the library stood. Some scrolls almost certainly burned, but notice what's missing from the official story. Caesar did not target the library. The fire was an accident of war, collateral damage, not a deliberate act of destruction. Then, more than 4 centuries later, in 391 of the Common Era, came a darker episode. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees banning pagan worship across the empire. In Alexandria, the Patriarch Theophilus led a mob against the Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis that housed a daughter collection of the
Great Library. Eyewitnesses recorded the scene. The historian Theodoret wrote that the temple was destroyed to its foundations. There is a strange human detail buried in the accounts. The mob hesitated to smash the statue of Serapis, afraid that toppling the god would bring catastrophe down on the city. Theophilus ordered a soldier to take an axe to its head. Nothing happened. No earthquake, no plague. And so the crowd, emboldened, tore the rest apart. And the third villain, the famous one, the Muslim Caliph Omar, who supposedly burned the books in 642 to heat the city's bathhouses. Here the historians are nearly unanimous, and the verdict matters. The story is a myth. It first appears more than 500 years after the conquest, in the writings of a 13th century chronicler named Bar Hebraeus. By the time Arab armies reached Alexandria, both of the city's great libraries had most likely been gone for 250 years. The scholar Roy MacLeod, in his study of the library, notes that the same quote was later pinned on Omar regarding the conquest of Persia too. It was a travelling legend, not a record of events. I want to be clear about this because the myth has been used to slander an entire faith. The Caliph did not burn the Library of Alexandria. There was, by then, no library left to burn. So if no single fire destroyed it, what did? This wasn't the first time a great institution died of neglect rather than violence, and it would not be the last. The most probable answer, the one most historians now accept, is almost disappointingly mundane. The library died of lost patronage. As the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened, torn by civil wars and palace intrigue, the money dried up. Scholars stopped being funded. Some were expelled outright during one purge of foreign intellectuals. The scrolls themselves were fragile things. Papyrus does not last forever, and in the damp sea air of Alexandria it crumbled, cracked, and faded. A great library is not a vault. It is a living thing that needs constant tending, constant copying, constant care. Stop feeding it, and it starves. The decline began as early as 145 before the Common Era, generations before Caesar ever set foot in Egypt. Pull back, and you'll notice the real pattern. We love a villain because a villain can be blamed and punished and learned from. But neglect has no face. Indifference holds no torch. And here is the question that should keep you up at night. What was actually in those scrolls? We know fragments, lost works of Aristotle, plays by Sophocles we will never read.
Astronomical observations centuries ahead of their time, medical texts, histories of nations that have left no other trace on earth. Entire ways of seeing the world, gone without a witness. But buried in that collection was something else, the sacred writings of the East, brought to Alexandria, translated, studied and argued over by Greek-speaking scholars who treated Holy Scripture the way they treated philosophy and poetry. The holy books of the Hebrews would pass through this city and emerge changed. The way I read this, Alexandria was never merely a warehouse of knowledge. It was a workshop. And the thing being built there, quietly, scroll by scroll, was the foundation of the book that half the world would one day call holy. That is the strange afterlife of Alexandria. The building is gone. The scrolls are ash and dust. But the work done inside those walls did not vanish. It survived, transformed, hidden inside texts we still read today. History doesn't teach us that knowledge is permanent. It teaches us the opposite, that the most precious things we make are also the easiest to lose, and that we rarely notice the loss until the smoke has long since cleared. The fire, it turns out, was never the real danger. Forgetting was.
There is a letter written in Greek more than 2,000 years ago, addressed from a man named Aristeas to his brother Philocrates. It survives today in over 20 manuscript copies, the oldest of them medieval, scattered across the libraries of Europe. The letter tells a remarkable story, how the holy book of the Jews came to be translated into Greek at the command of a king in the city of Alexandria. And here is the strange thing about that letter. Most scholars now believe it is a forgery, not a malicious one, but a fiction written long after the events it claims to describe by someone who was not there. The story it tells, though, true or invented, would change the religious history of the world. To understand why, you have to step inside the Alexandria of the 3rd century before the Common Era. The city is the wealthiest, most cosmopolitan place on earth. Its harbour swallows ships from every shore of the Mediterranean. And living within its walls is one of the largest Jewish communities outside of Judea. Tens of thousands of people, many of them born in Egypt, speaking Greek in the markets and the streets. Their grandparents had carried the Hebrew scriptures with them, but their children no longer read Hebrew. They thought in Greek. They prayed increasingly in Greek, and a sacred text that no one can read is a sacred text slowly dying. If you ask me, this is the quiet crisis that drives the whole story. Not a king's ambition, but a community watching its own holy book become a stranger to its children. According to the letter of Aristeas, the solution came from an unlikely source, the king himself. Ptolemy II, who reigned from around 285 to 246 before the Common Era, wanted every book in the world for his great library. His librarian informed him that the collection lacked one important work, the laws of the Jews. So the king wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem, a man named Eleazar, and requested translators. Eleazar sent 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. That number, 72, rounded down to 70, is where we get the name this translation still carries today, the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. The Hebrew scholar Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, added a detail that turned the translation into a miracle.
He claimed the 72 scholars were placed in separate rooms, each working alone, forbidden to consult one another. And when they emerged, every single translation matched the others, word for word, letter for letter. To Philo, and to the Jewish community of his day, this was proof. The Greek text was not merely a translation, it was divinely inspired, as holy as the Hebrew it came from. Now here's what I find striking. The historical record does not support the miracle, and it barely supports the letter. The historian working from the text in Britannica points out that the letter of Aristeas contains errors no eyewitness would make. Demetrius, the librarian named in the story, had actually been banished by Ptolemy II before these events supposedly took place. The whole account was most likely composed a century or more after the fact, by a Greek-speaking Jew defending the legitimacy of a translation his community already depended on. The way I read this, the legend was not written to explain how the Septuagint came to be. It was written to defend a translation people had already decided to trust. And the translation mattered because it did something no one fully intended. It took the God of a small Middle Eastern people, written in a language almost no one in the wider world could read, and made that God speak Greek, the language of philosophy, of commerce, of empire. For the first time, a Gentile in Athens or Rome could pick up the scriptures of Israel and simply read them. A local deity became, in principle, available to the entire world. We've seen this before in history, a translation that quietly outgrows its purpose, but rarely with consequences this vast. The first 5 books, the Torah, were translated first, probably between 282 and 250 before the Common Era. The rest followed over the next century or two, the work of many hands across many years. And it is in those later books, the prophets, that we find the single most consequential sentence in the entire Septuagint. A line from the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. The original Hebrew uses a word, Alma. In Hebrew, Alma means a young woman of marriageable age. There is a separate, specific Hebrew word for a virgin, Betula, and Isaiah did not use it. Most scholars today agree that Alma is best translated simply as young woman. But when the Greek translators reached that verse, they rendered Alma with the Greek word Parthenos. And Parthenos, in ordinary Greek, generally means virgin. Now, this is where you have to be careful, because this is one of the most contested single words in religious history, and reasonable people read it in opposite directions. One side argues the Greek translation introduced a meaning the Hebrew never carried, that a young woman quietly became a virgin somewhere in the crossing from one language to another. The other side points out something genuinely important. These Jewish translators were working 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus. They had no Christian doctrine to promote, no virgin birth to defend. If they chose Parthenos, perhaps they simply understood Alma in that context to imply a virgin all along. I am not going to tell you which reading is right. The honest answer is that scholars have argued this for centuries, and the debate is not settled. What strikes me most is how much can hang on so little, a single noun, in a single verse, in a book of many thousands. But notice what's missing from the simple version of the story. The author of the Gospel of Matthew, writing decades later, quoted this prophecy and applied it to the birth of Jesus. And the crucial point is this: Matthew was not translating the Hebrew, he was reading the Greek. He quoted the Septuagint, Parthenos and all. The translation made in Alexandria by Jewish scholars for a Jewish community became the foundation of a Christian doctrine those translators could never have imagined. That is the power hidden inside a single act of translation. And it was not the only one. The city that produced the Septuagint also produced a man named Philo, who did something just as transformative, though with ideas rather than words. Philo was a Jewish philosopher, the one event of whose life we can date with certainty being his journey as an ambassador to the Emperor Caligula in the year 40. Philo had been raised on two traditions at once, the Hebrew scriptures of his ancestors and the Greek philosophy of Plato, and he refused to choose between them. Instead, he read the Torah allegorically, searching beneath the literal words for hidden, deeper meanings that aligned with Greek thought. In Philo's hands, Moses began to look like a philosopher. The God of Israel acquired a divine intermediary, a bridge between the perfect, unknowable God and the imperfect material world. Philo called this intermediary the Logos, the Word. If that term sounds familiar, it should. Within a century, the Gospel of John would open with a line about the Word becoming flesh. Scholars still debate whether John borrowed directly from Philo or whether both men were simply breathing the same Alexandrian air. What this tells us is that the categories Christianity would later use to describe Jesus were already taking shape in a Jewish philosopher's study before Christianity existed. So here is the truth that the simple story leaves out. We tend to imagine sacred texts as fixed, eternal, handed down, unchanged. But every scripture is also a translation, and every translation is a series of human choices. Alexandria was where many of those choices got made, quietly, by scholars whose names we have mostly forgotten, in a language that was not the original. History doesn't teach us that holy books fall from the sky complete. It teaches us something humbler and stranger, that they are built, word by careful word, by people who could not see where their choices would lead. A single word, Alma or Parthenos, young woman or virgin. The distance between them is small, and the world that grew in that small gap is the world we still live in today.
The bishop was writing a letter that would decide which books got to be holy. It was early in the year 367 in the city of Alexandria, and the man bent over the page was named Athanasius. He had been the bishop here for nearly 4 decades, exiled 5 times, hunted, condemned, and each time restored. He was old now and tired, and he had seen what happened when Christians could not agree on what their own scriptures were. So that year, in his annual Easter letter to the churches under his care, he did something no one had done before. He listed them, the books that belonged. 27 of them for the New Testament, and then a line that closed a door that had stood open for 300 years. "Let no one add to these," he wrote. "Let nothing be taken away." To understand the weight of that sentence, you have to throw out almost everything you assume about early Christianity. We picture it as one faith, unified from the beginning, with one set of Gospels handed down intact. That picture is wrong. The historian Bart Ehrman, in his study of the faiths that did not survive, calls the early movement not Christianity, but Christianities, plural.
In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was no single Bible, no agreed list of sacred books, no central authority to enforce one. There were dozens of groups, each with its own scriptures, each certain it possessed the true teaching of Jesus. And Alexandria was the beating heart of that diversity. This was the most intellectually restless city in the ancient world, where Jewish philosophy, Greek logic, Egyptian mysticism, and the new Christian message all collided in the same crowded streets. It produced thinkers who read scripture allegorically, searching for hidden meanings beneath the surface. It produced Clement and Origen, brilliant Christian scholars who treated the faith like a philosophy to be reasoned through. And it produced something the bishops would come to fear, a movement we now call Gnosticism. Here's what I find striking about the Gnostics. They did not simply disagree about details. They told an entirely different story about the universe. In the mainstream account, one good God created the world and called it good. The Gnostics looked at the world, at its suffering, its cruelty, its decay, and drew the opposite conclusion. A world this broken, they reasoned, could not have been made by the highest God. It must have been made by a lesser being, a flawed, ignorant craftsman they called the demiurge, who fashioned the material world and then mistook himself for the supreme deity. Salvation, in this vision, was not about being forgiven. It was about waking up, acquiring secret knowledge, gnosis, the very knowledge the demiurge himself lacked. The material world was a kind of prison, and the divine spark trapped inside each person was straining to remember where it truly came from. It was a haunting idea, and a dangerous one, because if the creator of this world was not the true God, then the institutions built to worship that creator had no authority at all. This was not a minor heresy at the edges. Some of the most influential teachers in the 2nd century held views like these. A man named Valentinus, who came from Egypt and may well have studied in Alexandria, built one of the most sophisticated of these systems before moving to Rome around the year 130. For a time, Valentinus was so respected that some accounts say he was nearly made Bishop of Rome himself. The way I read this, the line between orthodox and heretic was far blurrier than the later winners wanted us to believe. The people we now call heretics were not outsiders throwing stones. They were insiders, often learned, often devout, arguing over the soul of the same young religion. And they had their own gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, with no story, no crucifixion, no resurrection, just teachings, many of them strange and beautiful. The Gospel of Mary, which gave Mary Magdalene a role as a teacher the other apostles resented. The secret book of John, which laid out the whole Gnostic cosmos of the demiurge and the hidden God above him. The Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself. These were not crude forgeries scribbled in the dark. They were serious religious texts, read and copied and treasured by communities who believed they held the deepest secrets of the faith. Three things stand out to me about these lost Gospels. They were old. Some scholars date the core of Thomas remarkably early. They were widespread, copied from Egypt to Syria, and they were not fringe. To the people who read them, these were not alternative scriptures, they were simply scripture. So why did they vanish? This is where Athanasius and his letter return to the story. By the 4th century, the situation had changed. The Emperor Constantine had legalized Christianity, and a legal religion needed boundaries, an official version, a fixed canon, a clear line between what was in and what was out. Notice what's missing from the comfortable version of this story. We are often told the canon was simply discovered, that the true books rose naturally to the top. But the record shows something more deliberate. Someone had to decide. And in 367, with the authority of the most powerful bishopric in the East, Athanasius decided. The 27 books he named are almost exactly the New Testament you can buy in any bookstore today. But I want to be fair about what he did and did not do. Athanasius was not inventing a canon from nothing. The New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger noted that his letter marks the first time anyone listed exactly these 27 books, but the consensus had been forming for generations. Origen, more than a century earlier, already treated most of these books as authoritative. This wasn't a secret council voting on scripture in a single night. It was the closing line of a centuries-long argument, written down at last by the man with the power to enforce it. What this tells us is that canons are not found. They are made by specific people in specific cities for specific reasons. And the books that did not make the list? Athanasius called them apocryphal and warned that they should never be mixed with the inspired scriptures. For monks across Egypt, that warning carried the force of law. Which brings us to a discovery that would not happen for another 1,500 years, a sealed jar buried in the sand of southern Egypt near a town called Nag Hammadi. Inside it, 13 leather-bound books. Gospels of Thomas, of truth, the secret book of John, the very texts Athanasius had condemned. The scholars who studied them, including James Robinson, who led the team that finally published them, traced their likely burial to the decades right after 367. Think about what that means. Someone, most probably a monk from one of the nearby monasteries, read the bishop's order to purge forbidden books. And instead of burning them, he could not bring himself to destroy them. He wrapped them carefully, sealed them in a jar, and buried them in the earth. He hid them. We've seen this before in history, the quiet defiance of someone who loves a forbidden thing too much to put it to the flame. And so the books waited. For 16 centuries they lay in the dark, while the canon Athanasius defined became the only Christianity most of the world would ever know. The losers of the argument were not just defeated, they were erased, their gospels denounced, their communities scattered, their version of the story buried so thoroughly that for 1,000 years we had only their enemies' descriptions of what they believed. Here is what should keep you up at night. The faith that a third of the planet now follows was not handed down whole and unchanging. It was shaped, argued into being, edited and bounded in cities like Alexandria by men like Athanasius, who made real choices that could have gone another way. History doesn't teach us that the winners were right. It teaches us only that they won, and that the winners get to decide which books are holy and which get buried in the sand. The roads not taken did not simply disappear. Some of them were waiting all along, just beneath the surface, for someone, someday, to dig them up again. Red earth baked hard by the sun, the smell of dust and dry stone at the foot of a cliff in southern Egypt. It was December of 1945, near a town called Nag Hammadi, and a farmer named Muhammad al-Saman was digging for fertilizer, the soft, nitrogen-rich soil that collects at the base of cliffs. His mattock struck something that was not earth. A large clay jar, sealed at the mouth, nearly a meter tall. He hesitated. There were stories about jars like this, that a spirit, a jinn, might be trapped inside. But there was another possibility, the one that wins out in moments like these. Gold. So he raised the mattock and broke it open. There was no gold. Inside were 13 books, bound in leather, their pages made of papyrus, written in an ancient form of the Egyptian language called Coptic. The farmer had no idea what he held. The story goes that some of the loose pages were used to light a fire in his mother's oven before anyone realized what they were. What survived, and most of it did survive, turned out to be the greatest archaeological discovery in the history of early Christianity. 52 texts, Gospels and Revelations and secret teachings that had not been read in 1600 years. These were the books we have been tracing all along: the Gospel of Thomas, the secret book of John, the Gospel of Truth, the very writings a bishop in Alexandria had condemned in the year 367. And here is what I find striking about where they were found. Nag Hammadi sits just a few miles from the site of one of the earliest Christian monasteries, founded by the monk Pachomius. The scholars who studied the find, including James Robinson, who led the team that finally published them in full, concluded that the most likely owners were monks from that very community. Men who had been ordered to destroy these books, and who instead buried them with care, sealed against the dry desert air that would preserve them for the better part of 2 millennia. Think about the choice that represents. Somewhere in the late 4th century, a person held these pages in his hands, knowing the church had declared them forbidden. He could have burned them. It would have been the safe thing, the obedient thing. Instead, he hid them, not to destroy the evidence, but to save it. The way I read this, that single act of quiet preservation is why we can read these Gospels today at all. One monk's refusal, against the weight of an entire institution, reached across 16 centuries and handed us back a piece of our own history. But Nag Hammadi was not the only place the desert kept its secrets. 50 years earlier, in the winter of 1896, 2 young scholars from Oxford arrived at an ancient garbage dump outside a ruined Egyptian town called Oxyrhynchus. Their names were Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. For weeks they dug through the rubbish mounds of a city that had been throwing things away for 1,000 years, and rubbish, it turns out, is a kind of accidental archive. People threw out tax records, private letters, shopping lists, and sometimes scripture. On the second day of one digging season in early 1897, Grenfell pulled a small scrap of papyrus from the sand. On it were sayings attributed to Jesus that no one in the modern world had ever read. For 50 years, no one knew exactly what that fragment was. Then Nag Hammadi was discovered, with its complete Gospel of Thomas in Coptic, and scholars realized the Oxyrhynchus scrap was a piece of the very same Gospel in the original Greek and older. The garbage dump and the buried jar were telling the same story from 2 different directions. Across decades, across hundreds of miles, the fragments were finding each other again. Here's what I find remarkable about that. Nobody planned it. No grand archive preserved these texts on purpose. They survived because a city was careless with its trash and a monk was careful with his fear, and 2,000 years later, the pieces fit. The work at Oxyrhynchus has never really stopped. More than 500,000 fragments were recovered, dating across nearly 1,000 years of history. They are housed now in Oxford, and scholars are still publishing them, volume after volume, more than 80 so far, with the vast majority still unread. And this is where the ancient story meets the modern laboratory. Many of these fragments are charred, faded, or so damaged that the ink is invisible to the naked eye. So researchers use a
technique called multispectral imaging, photographing the papyrus under different wavelengths of light, from infrared to ultraviolet, to make writing reappear that had vanished centuries ago. Letters that no human eye has seen since the Roman Empire surface again on a computer screen. Notice what's happening here. We are not simply reading these texts, we are reconstructing them, comparing thousands of fragments and copies, weighing one reading against another, rebuilding the original word by word through a discipline scholars call textual criticism. And the newest frontier uses machine learning to help piece together what damaged or scattered fragments once said. I want to be careful not to overstate this. These tools are not conjuring lost gospels out of nothing. They are doing something more modest and more real. They are helping us read what was always there, hidden in the damage, waiting. So pull back and look at the whole arc of this story. A library was born in Alexandria from a single, impossible dream, to gather all the knowledge in the world into one room. That dream collapsed, not in a single fire, but in the slow erosion of centuries. The sacred books that passed through that city were translated, reinterpreted, fought over, and finally bounded. Some declared holy, others condemned and buried. And then, against every expectation, the buried ones came back. Not whole, never whole, but in fragments, recovered from rubbish heaps and sealed jars, read again by machines the Ptolemies could never have imagined. This wasn't the first time the powerful tried to erase a version of history they found inconvenient, and it will not be the last. But it may be one of the few times the erased version clawed its way back into the light. You might think this is ancient history, sealed off from your life by 2,000 years, but consider what it actually means. The Bible that sits in hundreds of millions of homes is not a single book that fell from the sky. It is the survivor of a long human process of choosing, translation by translation, counsel by counsel, decision by decision. What this tells us is that the texts at the center of our civilization have a history as dramatic as any empire. They were made by people, argued over by people, lost and found and lost again by people. And here is what should keep you up at night. Everything we know about the roads not taken, the Gospels that lost, the readings that were overruled, the voices the winners tried to erase, we know only because something survived. A scrap in a garbage dump, a jar in the sand, a monk who could not bring himself to light the match. History does not preserve itself. It survives by accident, by stubbornness, by the smallest acts of care performed by people whose names we will never know. The vision of Alexandria, that everything worth knowing could be gathered and kept, was never really destroyed. It was scattered. And in some strange way, we are still trying to fulfill it. Every fragment digitized, every faded letter recovered, every lost gospel read again is a piece of that ancient dream, reassembling itself in the light. There is a single jar that started all of this, broken open by a farmer looking for fertilizer, holding books a bishop had ordered destroyed. It sits today in a museum in Cairo, behind glass, quiet and unremarkable to look at. And every time someone stands before it,
They are looking at the proof of a quiet truth, that what the powerful try to bury, the patient and the curious can always dig back up. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.